The Woods by MysticMutic. My friend's family owned a cabin in the mountains. Now, my friend, let's call him Carter, was finally able to get a bunch of us together for a weekend away. After a few years of being separated by colleges across the state, it was good to get the gang back together again, at least in theory. It took 2 cars to get the 6 of us and all of our things up there. Carter was driving the lead car with Logan and Ray. I was the driver in the following car with my girlfriend Joanna and our friend Sam. We pulled up to the cabin as the sun had already set over the horizon. Given the time of year, we had expected the sunlight to leave us early. We'd messed up a little on the exact time of our arrival. We unloaded the car at breakneck speeds to avoid the incoming darkness. With only the lights from the streetlights that were partially blocked from the road, it would soon be difficult to see. Not to mention that it was cold. Once everything was inside and the cars were locked up, we made a grand meal for our first night. The cabin itself had a gorgeous interior with a fireplace, a fully renovated kitchen, and a dining area. A comfortable living room with 2 couches and a recliner, and a back porch that led out to an expansive backyard. Upstairs was an array of bedrooms, and then there was the small attic which sat at the top of it all. Although we likely wouldn't be spending too much time in the cabin, it was such a nice place to just sit back and relax when we really needed it. The next morning, later than any of us had intended, Carter and Sam led our small group through the trails. Although it was cold, there wasn't any call for snowfall. Even so, the noise of crushed, half-frozen foliage, branches, and grass was hard to ignore. We'd stop every once in a while to talk with other hikers or take pictures of the views or just settle down for a snack. Unlike the others, I took pictures as we walked. Mostly candid photos of the group or the scenery in motion rather than anything posed. At one point, we sat down on a few rocks that gave us a nice view of the stream below. I was half listening to their idle conversation as I sat leaned up against Joe, going through the pictures that I'd taken so far. Most of them weren't bad, so I started to show them to the others. They were passing the camera around, going through the pictures, and commenting on what they saw. Ray spoke up, a tone of urgency in his voice. He looked over to me with wide eyes on colorless features. "You didn't look at them all, did you?" he said. I shook my head. "Look at this," he said, holding out the camera to me. Sitting up, I took the camera back from him and I tried to see what had caused all the commotion. At first glance, the image looked like one of the other dozens of candid group shots I had taken. And then I saw it. My heart leapt into my throat, and I felt my whole body stiffen. There was no way that all 6 of us had missed something like that. It was just beyond the tree line, in the darkness offered by the shadows of the thick trees and leaves. The thing was humanoid, but it seemed too lanky and disproportionate. Any of its other descriptive features were difficult to make out due to the camera's focus being on the center of the group, who happened to be Sam at that time rather than the tree line. What I could make out, though, didn't make me think that this thing was human. The image, as grainy as it was, struck me with a sort of primal fear that made my heart hammer violently against my ribcage. "What is that?" Joe's voice sounded terrified as she struggled to get the words out properly. I'd never heard her voice break like it did in that moment. That sense of fear only made my own fear all the more present. "Nobody saw it?" I asked, looking at the others. "There's no way we'd see that and just keep walking," Carter said after taking a look at the image. Nobody had any theories. They all just stayed silent, and I felt frozen for a moment as my mind tried to get a grip on what was going on. It could have been a trick of the light, or some sort of image malfunction. After all, the camera was an old one, which was the whole reason I took it out on the hike in the first place. When I reminded the others of this fact, they all seemed to relax a little. Still, we packed up and we took another path back to the cabin. This one took a little bit longer than before, so we ended up back there later than we expected. but it was better to be safe than sorry, I suppose. By the time we managed to settle down, it was late in the evening. Although we'd worked to distance ourselves from that thing, I know that it was truly impossible. Joe and I rolled over to face one another and went on with a silent conversation in hopes of taking our minds off the image. Somehow, we both managed to fall asleep, but, as you probably could have guessed, it didn't last long. It was in the early hours of the morning that I was woken by a loud sound that I couldn't for the life of me remember. As soon as my eyes had opened and the gears of my mind had shifted into high gear, the memory of the sound vanished. All I did know was that it had happened, and whatever it was loud enough to wake even a heavy sleeper such as myself. Joe was already upright beside me, looking to be listening intently as though for a repeat of the noise. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, trying to look around and see what could have been the source of the sound. Nothing looked out of place or even odd in any sense. It only made the feeling of terror that much worse. Do you... Joe had started to speak, but it seemed that at the very moment she opened her mouth, a terrifying scream broke through the cabin. We both bolted out of bed and ran as fast as we could, tearing through the halls and bursting into the room with Ray and Logan. They were on their feet, with Ray standing closer to the door than Logan, who was against the window. He seemed to be pressing his hands against it as though to keep it closed. I ran over to his side as Joe tried to get the story out of Ray. Carter and Sam just about ran over one another, getting into the room behind us. As Ray stammered to tell us what had happened, I was focused on the window and just why Logan was pressed against it in such a way, especially when his friend was on the other side of the room, struggling to keep it all together. That moment, my eyes switched to look outside, and I fully understood why. My heart skipped a beat as my eye focused on the creature that surged back into the tree line. While I hadn't got a good look at it, I did see that the figure appeared to be running on all fours. It made my body go cold all over, and I felt frozen to the spot where I stood. I looked over to Logan, whose features were pale, with wide, watered eyes, focused intently on the forest. It took Logan a moment before he could step back from the window, releasing his iron-tight grip on it. I didn't even realize that I was shaking until Logan rested a hand on my shoulder, trying to steady his own racing heart. I turned to the others to try to get a better idea of what had just happened. As it turns out, Ray was awoken by a sound outside, likely the same noise that had caused the rest of us to wake up. As Logan was struggling to get up, Ray went over to the window to get a better idea of the animal running around outside. In his half-asleep state, he couldn't even begin to consider the idea that the thing from the picture could have possibly been out there. When he pressed up against the window, trying to look out into the darkness, he couldn't see a thing. He said he was so busy cursing as he threw open the heavy window that he didn't at first hear the sounds of the branches snapping. And by the time he did, it was already too late. The creature was there, just a few feet away from the wall, about half the way into the yard. Ray said he was just standing there, staring at him with dark eyes that couldn't have been natural. The thing had been tall. He guessed almost 7 feet tall. It had a gaunt, lanky form with limbs that were all too long to fit even with the thing's tall form. For what could have just been a second or two long, Ray couldn't move. He felt like his whole body was rooted to the floor as fear dug deep into his bones. His body started to shake, and he was unable to control the tremors that ran through him and made his blood run cold. When the creature started to move, Ray let out a scream that caused everyone else in the house to bolt out of their beds. Logan's half-asleep state had vanished as he threw the covers off and ran to Ray's aid, slamming the window shut just as the thing's hand had reached the glass. Logan said that it tried to get inside, though it seemed unable to understand how the window worked. It ran off the moment that Joanna and I all but broke down the door. Sam stayed with Ray, as the rest of us searched around the house to try to find any traces that the creature might still have been roaming around outside. The only thing we found was deep scratches along the wall beneath and around the window it nearly got through. Carter tried his best to try and figure out what sort of creature this thing was. Even though he was the reigning outdoorsman of the group, having spent his childhood in the woods with his father, nothing made any sense, he said. With how Ray described it, the scratches should have been long but shallow given its gaunt and lanky form. We searched the perimeter of the property, and we found no other sign of the creature. So we made our way back to the cabin. Carter grabbed the gun that his father kept in the cabin, loaded it, and rested it against the living room wall. We all slept together in the living room as none of us could bear the thought of sleeping in pairs again. I know I wasn't the last one to fall asleep, but even I stayed up well into the early hours of the morning. Every time I managed to close my eyes, all I could see was an image of that thing running back into the forest. I can't imagine that Ray and Logan got any sleep either. It was about midday when I finally woke up to find the curtains had been drawn closed. Scattered around me were the passed out forms of Logan, Ray, and Sam. It must have been one of the others who drew the curtains closed to let the rest of us get even a few more hours of much-needed sleep. I quietly made my way into the kitchen, careful not to wake the others as I moved. Due to the sudden change in lighting from the living room to the kitchen, my pace was slowed to a stop as I covered my eyes and groaned. Still, I appreciated the light more in all its painful forms. Everything was less terrifying in the daylight. We did our best to keep our mind off of what had happened, and to do that, we hardly even went near the forest for that day's events. Instead, we spent our time fishing and canoeing in the nearby lake. Although Ray seemed distracted no matter how hard we tried to keep him included. Logan and myself, however, were able to enjoy ourselves. After all, Logan and I had a theory that if we faked happiness long enough, it would be real, and we were right. On the other hand, this concept seemed much more difficult for Ray. But, considering what he had seen, we were surprised that he was enjoying himself as much as he was. At one point, we were all sitting out on a small dock at the edge of the water, with a few of us in lawn chairs that we'd brought with us. I was sitting with my legs off to the side of the sturdy wooden dock, with my fishing rod in hand. Logan was sitting beside me. Carter was on the far side, and he leaned against the rail to smoke a cigarette. He was being nice enough to put some space between us and his smoke. Sam was sitting in the lawn chair, playing cards with Ray. Joe had just returned from the cabin with a canister in hand and poured me a hot drink before pouring one for herself. After handing me the cup, she collapsed onto her own lawn chair with a sigh. It was all so peaceful. "Spiked," I said as I set the cup down before leaning back and looking over to a grinning Joe. "I thought it would keep you warm," she said. Now, I'm no lightweight by any means. But as my gaze lazily shifted across the lake, I could have sworn that the liquor had gotten to me. At least, that's what I tried to tell myself anyway. The image was quick, and it looked like it had darted back into the brush the moment my gaze caught it. No, I think my gaze was caught by the quick movement, as if it had moved before that. I was snapped back to reality when something started pulling on the previously dead fishing line. With how long my hook had been in the water, it seemed odd that now, all of a sudden, it would catch something. Setting my drink down, I started to reel in the line, wondering what could be on the other end of it. The others were all focused on me now as I managed to reach out and grab the line, and I tugged the object out of the water with force. The scream that tore through my throat was deafening. On the end of the line was an animal, that looked like it had been mangled beyond repair. I nearly threw the entire rod and scrambled to an uneasy standing position. Logan mimicked my movements, and we backed away from the edge of the deck as the others had nearly overturned their chairs getting onto their feet. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears, and I did my best to rationalize what I had seen. It's not like seeing a mangled animal in the woods was a totally odd thing, but it was in this area of the woods. This was a community where there were limits on where people could hunt, and the sorts of animals that made their way through here was limited. Even this body of water was pretty closed off from the rest of the woods, meaning that it was pretty controlled. There was no way that the animal could have been mangled in this community and dropped into the water to have drifted over to us. Even if all of that was true, that the animal was somehow attacked and dropped into the water, how did it get latched onto my hook, and how did I manage to pull it in? The rod was slipping into the water, and something made me lurch over to snag it. Had it not been for Joanna's quick hand gripping the back of my shirt, I might have fallen into the cold but shallow water. It was a good thing that I hadn't, because in those moments, when I was suspended in the air before Joe pulled me back onto the dock, I noticed a figure lurking beneath the surface of the lake. I blinked, and it was gone, but its form was undeniable. My footing was off as I pulled back, causing me to land hard on Joanna's feet. The fishing rod clambered onto the wood by my own feet, and almost reflexively, I kicked it away as I scrambled back. We all just stayed frozen in our spots, eyes locked on the fishing rod. Mine were actually locked on the shadow-like figure in the water. I could hear the rapid breathing coming from the others as they tried to control their heart rates to varying degrees of success. My own breathing was intense, but I tried to slow it. Not for my racing heart, but for the pain in my throat from the scream. Just as fast as the figure had appeared, the figure vanished. Although we wanted nothing more than to get out of there, we decided to stay one more night in the cabin to ensure that we got home without any sleep-deprived accidents. After all, driving at night in this area was difficult enough with a group of well-rested drivers. Even if we drove home the next morning tired, we'd be better off with the sunlight keeping those hellish roads visible. Deciding that the final night of our little vacation was going to be ruined, we sat around the campfire Carter had worked so hard on setting up earlier that day. Although we made s'mores as the night before, we did not drink liquor, and instead just stayed with a round of hot drinks. That seemed to be the only thing keeping our cold muscles from tensing any more than they already were. Although the conversation flowed pretty well, anyone listening would have been able to easily tell that we were very distracted. It turns out that the thing really was going to ruin our last night of freedom. Slowly, throughout the course of the evening, we started to relax a little. Though we were still on guard, we didn't feel the need to keep constantly looking over our shoulders to see if we were being watched. We all knew, or at least we hoped, that we would feel such a thing, as we always had with other humans and animals. Carter still had his hunting rifle across his lap, and while he wasn't clutching it as tightly as he had before, he was still ready to use it at a moment's notice. That image alone was enough to send a shiver down the length of my spine. About halfway through our little campfire, right after downing the first few s'mores, I had the urge to go to the bathroom, so I headed back to the cabin. But Joanna, the knight in shining armor that she was, decided to come with me. Looking back, it's a very good thing that she did. I don't know where I'd be now if it wasn't for her protective nature. She was sitting outside, likely against the wall on her phone, as I did my business in the bathroom. While I felt safer with her sitting just a few feet away, there was something gnawing at me, as though to tell me that it wasn't as safe as I thought it was. I brushed it off as paranoia, but nevertheless, I finished up quickly. It happened the moment I turned the water off, after I had finished washing my hands. To be honest, I think it had been going on before that, but the loud noise, caused by the pipes, just blocked the sound from hitting my ears. It was coming from just outside the window, and since the bathroom sat on the first floor, I knew that whatever was out there was too close for comfort. My whole body froze, and I felt rooted to the ground for a moment. Then I did something that I never thought I would ever do, and something that could have very easily gotten me killed. I marched over to the window, and I threw it open with force. The noise echoed throughout the house, and I heard Joanna scramble to her feet outside before she threw open the door. I wasn't paying much attention to that, though. Not even a glance over my shoulder in her direction. My gaze was instead focused on the thing that had leapt back from the window at my sudden movements, and the loud sounds they had created. Instead of scurrying back into the woods as it so often did, the creature stood up. All the confidence I had mustered up drained from me, causing my legs to go weak. It was tall, inhumanly lanky, with the dark, thick-looking skin that Ray had described. There was something about it that seemed unnatural. If I knew anything, it was that this creature didn't belong, and that terrified me more than anything else. The creature's dark and lifeless eyes were boring into mine, and it felt like it was looking right into my core. Go! I managed to yell with enough force for the sound to reach the creature. My voice had not sounded so broken since the first time I tried to speak in the hospital after my accident. The creature seemed to make a noise, but from where I was, I couldn't tell what it was. It had no mouth to speak from. It made the same noise once more, and this time, I could fully understand what it had said, and I felt a wave of nausea flood through me. Help me. I need help. He's hurting me. Joanna sprang to life and grabbed me with one arm wrapped around my neck and the other over my eyes. I had no idea what was going on until she was dragging me away, screaming for the others at the top of her lungs. She sounded utterly terrified. I could hear the strain in her voice as tears likely ran down her cheeks. As before, I had no idea what was happening, but there was no use in fighting her. We got out of the room, and she let go of me to slam the door shut as the others piled in. "Get your things," she yelled to them in a commanding tone that cemented her as one of the group's parents. "We're leaving now. I don't care if we all have to take a half-hour shifts. We are getting out of here," she said. That was all it took for everyone to run around the house, getting our things together and getting them outside. We left the food we'd brought in the kitchen and some stray things in the living room, but they were all easily replaceable. Carter brought his rifle on the drive home instead of locking it back up, and the whole time he was cursing about how he would have to explain everything to his parents. That didn't stop any of us from moving fast as we were getting out of there. I was the last one to run out of the building, throwing Carter's bag into the front car before booking it back to Joe's car, which sat a few feet away. Her scream was the last thing that I heard before I felt my leg being violently tugged out from under me. I landed in the snow face first, with a dog-like yelp escaping my raw throat. My free leg instantly went out as I tried to kick the thing away from me. Terrified to look back, but I had to. My eyes locked on the creature, and its form is something I won't soon forget. It haunts my nightmares to this day. The creature looked more inhuman than ever, with its limbs contorted at angles that would break a normal person's bones in several places. That long arm reached up to me, and before I knew it, the claws reached into my back, but I twisted before they could sink into my skin. Instead, the claws caught my left arm, and while I know I screamed, I can't remember what it sounded like. A loud shot rang through the air, causing the creature's hand to pull back violently. It moved off of me at a slower speed than it had showcased before, but it was able to get back into the tree line as the others surrounded me. Joe hauled me into the back seat of the car as Sam leapt into the front seat. We got out of there, and Joanna did her best to patch me up. Despite Joe's attempts to keep me awake, I passed out in the back seat of the SUV. I woke up in the hospital a few days later, and the doctor told me that I was attacked by an animal and shouldn't have been out drinking in such an area. It turns out that the others had lied to the doctor about what had happened, fearing that he wouldn't believe them, and thus that he wouldn't let them see me. My arm had some serious damage from the creature's attack, leading the doctors to believe that whatever got me was large and powerful. Even after years of physical therapy, that arm still doesn't function how it used to, but it's become more manageable over the years. What I couldn't shake were the words that the creature had said to me, the ones that it used to try to lure me out into the forest. They were the same words that my little sister had said to me when the man snatched her from the playground. How it could have known that was a mystery. After all, only Joanna had ever heard about that story. After my time in the cabin, I started to experience things. Unnatural things. Shadows in the corners of rooms. Figures moving about. Voices that seemed to come from nowhere. And even the sounds of kids playing when there were no kids to be found. I have no idea what that thing did to me. The reason I'm finally telling all this is because I saw something last night. I think that the creature that we encountered at Carter's cabin isn't up there anymore, and it hasn't been for a long time.